The autumn sun cast long shadows through the windows of Judge Michael Sullivan's chambers at the Superior Court of Chicago. At 45, his salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an air of distinguished authority that matched his reputation. He stood before the vintage mirror that had belonged to his father, also a judge, carefully adjusting his black robe. Another day of justice served, he whispered to himself, a morning ritual that helped center his thoughts. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders as he reviewed the day's schedule. His clerk, Sarah Chen, knocked softly before entering with a fresh stack of case files. "Good morning, Your Honor," Sarah said, placing the files on his mahogany desk. "The Chicago Legal Times mentioned you in their monthly review. They're calling you the fair-minded pillar of Cook County." She smiled, knowing Sullivan's dislike for public attention. Sullivan raised an eyebrow, picking up the newspaper. "They should spend less time writing headlines and more time reporting on cases that matter," he remarked, though a slight smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. His dedication to justice had earned him respect among his peers, even if he preferred to let his work speak for itself. The morning sunlight illuminated the photographs on his wall. His graduation from law school, his first day as a judge, and various community events. Yet among these celebrations of achievement, there was a noticeable gap, a space where family photos might have been. Sullivan's eyes lingered there for a moment before returning to the tasks at hand. "What's our first case?" he asked, settling into his leather chair. Sarah pulled out the morning's docket, her organized nature matching his own methodical approach to the law. "We have several traffic violations, 2 small claims disputes, and a property line disagreement that's been ongoing," she reported efficiently. The morning news also mentioned possible protests downtown, but nothing near the courthouse. Sullivan nodded, reviewing the files with practiced precision. His reputation for thorough preparation was well known throughout the courthouse. Even routine cases received his full attention, believing that every person deserving their day in court should receive nothing less than his best judgment. The courthouse began to stir with activity outside his chambers. The familiar sounds of security checks, elevator chimes, and clicking heels against marble floors created the morning symphony he had grown accustomed to over his 15 years on the bench. Legal aides hurried past his door, their arms full of documents. Lawyers gathered in small groups, discussing their cases in hushed tones. 10 minutes until first call, Sarah reminded him, heading toward the door. And Judge Sullivan. The maintenance staff finally fixed the heating in the courtroom. No more Arctic temperatures. He chuckled, remembering the previous week's complaints from shivering attorneys. Thank goodness for small mercies. We can't have justice served cold, can we? Standing up, Sullivan gathered his notes and took one final look in the mirror. His father's words echoed in his mind. A judge's role isn't just to make decisions, but to listen with an open heart. It was advice he carried through every case, through every decision. As he prepared to leave his chambers, his eyes caught the morning headlines once again. Fair-minded pillar seemed to mock him slightly. He wondered, as he often did, if he truly deserved such praise. Every day brought new challenges, new stories, new lives intersecting in his courtroom. Today would be no different, or so he thought, unaware that fate had planned an unexpected reunion that would challenge everything he believed about himself and his role as a judge. The clock struck 9, and Judge Michael Sullivan stepped out of his chambers, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The afternoon session was drawing to a close when Jasmine Turner hurried into courtroom 4B. Her blue hospital scrubs, slightly wrinkled from a 12-hour night shift, stood out among the formal attire of the other attendees. Dark circles beneath her eyes betrayed her exhaustion, yet she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Last case of the day," Sarah announced, handing Judge Sullivan the file. "Parking violation, Your Honor." Jasmine stepped forward to the defendant's podium, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting her determination despite her evident fatigue. Judge Sullivan glanced down at the citation, then back at the young woman before him. "Miss Turner, His voice carried through the nearly empty courtroom. "You're charged with parking in a restricted zone on Michigan Avenue last Thursday. The fine is $275. How do you plead?" "Your Honor," Jasmine began, her voice steady despite her nervousness, "I understand the violation, but I'd like to explain the circumstances." She pulled out her phone, showing a series of photographs. "My car broke down unexpectedly. I was heading home from my night shift at Mercy Hospital, where I work as a pediatric nurse." Sullivan leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued by her composed demeanor. Most defendants in traffic court tended to be either argumentative or overly apologetic. Jasmine was neither. She simply stated her case with clarity and respect. "I called for a tow truck immediately," she continued, producing a receipt from her folder. "But it was rush hour, and they couldn't reach me for nearly 2 hours. I couldn't stay with the car because I had to get home to care for my grandmother before her caregiver left. I did everything I could to handle the situation properly." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Sullivan reviewed the evidence she presented. Through the tall windows, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden benches. A court officer stifled a yawn, and the stenographer's fingers hovered over her keys, waiting. "Miss Turner," Sullivan spoke, adjusting his glasses, "while I appreciate your detailed explanation and the evidence you've provided, the law is clear regarding parking violations in that area. It's a high-traffic zone, and exceptions could create dangerous precedents." Jasmine's shoulders dropped slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I understand, Your Honor. I respect the law and its purpose. I'm only asking for consideration of the circumstances. I work night shifts to provide better care for my patients, and I'm also putting myself through advanced nursing courses." Something in her voice, perhaps its quiet determination or the genuine sincerity, caused Sullivan to pause. He glanced again at her file, his eyes catching on her date of birth. A slight furrow appeared between his brows, so brief that only Sarah, who had worked with him for years, noticed it. "The court acknowledges your honest presentation of the facts, Miss Turner," Sullivan said, his tone maintaining its professional distance. "However, we must maintain consistent application of parking regulations. The fine will stand at $275, but you may arrange a payment plan with the clerk's office if needed." Jasmine nodded, accepting the verdict with grace. "Thank you for your time, Your Honor." She gathered her documents, tucking them carefully into her worn leather bag. As she turned to leave, the late sun caught her profile, and for a moment, Sullivan felt an inexplicable sense of déjà vu. "Court is adjourned," he announced, rising from the bench. But as he gathered his papers, his eyes followed Jasmine's retreating figure, an unsettling feeling taking root in his chest. Something about this case, about this young woman, tugged at the edges of his memory, like a forgotten dream struggling to surface. Back in his chambers, Judge Sullivan's attention drifted from the stack of pending cases before him. The afternoon light had softened, casting a golden glow across his desk where Jasmine Turner's file lay open. Something about her birth date, March 15, 1990, kept drawing his eyes back to the document. He leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses and pinching the bridge of his nose. The date sparked a memory, one he'd tucked away so deeply that its emergence now felt almost physical. March 15, 1990, the day his parents brought home a baby girl, a day filled with both joy and uncertainty. "Sarah," he called out, his voice slightly strained, "could you bring me the archive access codes? I need to look up some old records." While waiting, Sullivan opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small leather-bound photo album. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages, past family vacations and holiday gatherings, until he reached a particular photograph. It showed a teenage version of himself holding a baby girl, his mother and father beaming beside them. Sarah returned with the codes, pausing at the door. "Is everything all right, Your Honor? You seem distracted." "Just following up on something," he replied, trying to maintain his usual composure. After Sarah left, he logged into the adoption records database, his heart pounding as he entered the search parameters. The screen flickered, and documents began to appear. His eyes scanned the information rapidly. Baby girl, born March 15, 1990. Adopted by Michael and Eleanor Sullivan, renamed Sarah Joy Sullivan. His throat tightened as he read further, discovering records of the custody arrangements following his parents' bitter divorce. More pieces began falling into place. His father had moved to Boston for a federal judgeship, taking teenage Michael with him. His mother had stayed in Chicago with baby Sarah, but after her sudden illness, the child had entered the foster system. The trail of documents told a story of bureaucratic procedures that had torn apart what remained of their family. Sullivan opened another browser window, searching for more recent records. His sister's name had been changed during her time in foster care to Jasmine Turner, the same Jasmine Turner who had stood in his courtroom just hours ago. The weight of this realization hit him like a physical force. He thought of her standing before him, showing the same quiet dignity their mother had always possessed. How had he not seen it? The resemblance to their mother was there, in the way she held herself, in the determined set of her jaw. Memories flooded back, reading stories to baby Sarah, helping their mother keep bottles, promising to always protect his little sister, promises that life and circumstance had forced him to break. A knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. Judge Sullivan. Sarah's concerned voice carried through the wood. "Your next appointment is here." "Give me a moment," he called back, his voice rougher than usual. He quickly saved the documents he'd found and closed the browser windows. Standing up, he walked to his office window, looking out over the Chicago skyline. As the sun began to set, the city lights were beginning to twinkle on, each one representing countless stories, countless lives intersecting in ways both mundane and extraordinary. Today, his own story had taken an unexpected turn, one that would force him to confront not only his past, but also his present role as a judge. He straightened his robe, took a deep breath, and turned back to his desk. The weight of his discovery pressed heavily on his shoulders, but years of judicial training helped him maintain his composure. There would be time later to process this revelation. For now, he had a decision to make about how to proceed with this newfound knowledge. During his lunch break, Judge Sullivan sat alone in his chambers, the usual stack of sandwiches from his favorite deli untouched. Instead, he spread old family documents across his desk, creating a timeline of events that had led to this moment. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the aging manila envelope marked Family Records. The first document he pulled out was Sarah's, now Jasmine's, original adoption certificate. His mother's elegant signature graced the bottom, alongside his father's bold scrawl. Next came a series of photographs. Christmas mornings, summer picnics, moments frozen in time before everything fell apart. "Your Honor," Sarah's voice came through the intercom. "Judge Martinez asked if you'd like to join him for lunch." "Not today," he responded, his voice distant. "I need to focus on some personal matters." He picked up a photograph that made his heart catch, his mother holding baby Sarah in the hospital garden, both of them bathed in spring sunlight. The memory was vivid. He had taken that picture himself, proud of his new role as a big brother. The following images tracked Sarah's first steps, first birthday, the ordinary moments that had seemed so permanent then. Sullivan opened his laptop, accessing court records from the period after his parents' divorce. The documents painted a painful picture. His mother's declining health, the desperate attempts to maintain custody, and finally, the heart-wrenching decision to place Sarah in foster care. He had been away at college then, focused on his own future, unaware of how drastically his sister's life was changing. A notification popped up on his screen, an email from the foster care system archives. His hand shook as he opened it, revealing a comprehensive file on Jasmine Turner. Her journey through various foster homes, her academic achievements despite the instability, her determination to become a nurse, it all spoke to a resilience that both impressed and pained him. He found himself reaching for his phone, scrolling to his mother's number. She had retired to Florida years ago, their relationship strained by old wounds and unspoken regrets. The phone rang several times before her familiar voice answered. "Michael, this is unexpected." "Mom," he began, his judicial composure cracking slightly. "I need to ask you about Sarah." The silence on the other end stretched for several heartbeats. "You found her, haven't you?" "She was in my courtroom today," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "She goes by Jasmine now. She's a nurse." His mother's soft intake of breath carried years of buried emotion. "Just like I wanted to be, before I chose law instead." Another pause. "How is she?" "Strong. Determined. She reminds me so much of you." The conversation continued, filling in gaps in the story. His mother shared details about her attempts to reconnect, the letters returned unopened, the calls unanswered. The foster system had protected Jasmine's privacy, making it impossible to reach her directly. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk, Sullivan began organizing the documents into a new folder. The evidence was undeniable. The sister he had lost track of years ago had somehow found her way back into his life, only to face him across his own courtroom. He picked up the traffic citation that had brought her before him, seeing it now with new eyes. The fine he had imposed seemed suddenly harsh, impersonal, yet it was this very citation that had led to their paths crossing again. Looking at his court calendar for the next day, Sullivan made a decision. He would need to find a way to reach out to Jasmine, to bridge the gap that years and circumstance had created. But first, he needed to ensure that any action he took would be both legally and ethically sound. His role as a judge demanded nothing less. Evening settled over Chicago as Judge Sullivan remained in his office, the city lights twinkling like stars through his window. The day's revelations weighed heavily on his mind as he carefully reviewed the ethical guidelines for judges, searching for the proper way to handle this unprecedented situation. His desk phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. "Michael," his mother's voice came through clearly, continuing their earlier conversation. "There's something else you should know about Sarah, about Jasmine." He reached for his pen, an old habit from his early days as a lawyer. "Go on, Mom." "After you left for college with your father, I tried to keep her. I was working 2 jobs. But the medical bills..." Her voice cracked slightly. "The doctor said I needed immediate treatment. The social worker suggested temporary foster care, just until I recovered. But things got complicated." Sullivan closed his eyes, remembering those years. He had been so focused on law school, on following his father's footsteps, that his mother's letters had become less frequent, then stopped altogether. He had assumed she was respecting his need to focus on his studies. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked softly. "You were pursuing your dreams, Michael. Your father had already convinced you that I was..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "That I was too emotional, not practical enough. I couldn't bear to prove him right." The truth of her words stung. His father's influence had shaped his worldview, including his approach to justice. Logical, unwavering, sometimes rigid. Today's discovery had shaken that foundation. "I have her hospital records," his mother continued. "Letters I wrote but never sent. Photos from before. Everything. I've kept them all, hoping someday." Sullivan opened his laptop, creating a new document. "Could you send them to me? And Mom, I need to know, did you ever try to contact her after she turned 18? Every year on her birthday, I would search online. I found her nursing school graduation announcement 3 years ago. But by then, it felt too late. What right did I have to disrupt her life?" The same question now echoed in Sullivan's mind. As a judge, he had built his reputation on fairness and proper procedure. But as a brother, the territory was far less certain. He glanced at Jasmine's case file again, noting her address, just a few miles from their old family home. "Mom, she works at Mercy Hospital, in pediatrics. She's doing well, despite everything." His mother's soft sob carried through the phone, just like she always wanted. Even as a toddler, she was always taking care of her dolls, naming them all after flowers. Sullivan remembered daisies and roses lined up on the living room floor, receiving careful attention from tiny hands. The memory brought an unexpected smile to his face. "I need to make this right," he said firmly. "Not as a judge, but as her brother. I just need to figure out how." After ending the call, Sullivan began drafting a letter. He wrote and rewrote, each version attempting to bridge the vast gap that time and circumstance had created. The ethical implications of their courtroom encounter would need to be addressed, but more importantly, he needed to find the right words to begin healing their fractured family. As midnight approached, he looked at the final draft, alongside a formal request for recusal from any future cases involving Jasmine Turner. His judicial assistant would question it. His colleagues might raise eyebrows, but he knew it was the only proper course of action. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of reaching out to his sister, not as Judge Sullivan, but as the brother who had once promised to protect her. The weight of discovery was heavy, but for the first time in years, it carried with it a glimmer of hope. The private meeting room in the courthouse was quieter than usual on Friday afternoon. Judge Sullivan had chosen this time carefully, when most staff would be leaving for the weekend. He stood by the window, his black robe replaced by a simple gray suit, watching people stream out of the building into the warm afternoon. Sarah, his clerk, placed a carafe of water and 2 glasses on the wooden table. "Miss Turner confirmed she'll be here at 4, Your Honor. Are you sure you don't want me to stay?" "Thank you, Sarah, but this needs to be private," he replied, checking his watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes. On the table lay the family album, along with the folder of documents his mother had overnight expressed from Florida. At precisely 4 o'clock, a soft knock echoed through the room. Sullivan took a deep breath, straightening his tie. "Come in." Jasmine entered, still in her hospital scrubs, looking uncertain. "Judge Sullivan, your clerk said this was about my case, but I don't understand." "Please, sit down." He gestured to the chair across from him. "This isn't about your traffic violation. It's about something far more personal." His hand rested on the family album, his fingers tracing its worn edges. Jasmine sat, her posture tense. "I don't understand." Sullivan opened the album to the first page, where the hospital photo of his mother holding baby Sarah lay protected under clear plastic. "Do you recognize anyone in this photograph?" Leaning forward, Jasmine studied the image. Her eyes widened slightly, then narrowed in confusion. "That baby. The blanket has the same pattern as one in my earliest foster care photos, but that's impossible." "Not impossible," Sullivan said softly, turning to the next page. "Your original name was Sarah Joy Sullivan. You were adopted by Michael and Eleanor Sullivan on March 15, 1990. I was 14 when they brought you home." The color drained from Jasmine's face as she stared at the photographs. Birthday parties, family picnics, moments from a life she couldn't remember. Her hands trembled as she reached for one showing a teenage boy holding a baby, both laughing at something off camera. "That's you," she whispered. Sullivan nodded, his throat tight. "I'm your brother, Jasmine. When our parents divorced, Dad took me to Boston for law school. Mom stayed here with you, but when she got sick..." He paused, gathering himself. "The system separated us. By the time I understood what had happened, your records were sealed." Jasmine stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "All these years in foster care, wondering if anyone was looking for me." She turned back, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And you're a judge. The same judge who just fined me last week." "I didn't know," Sullivan said earnestly, standing but keeping his distance. "Not until I saw your birth date in the court records." "Mom. Our mom. She's in Florida now. She'd love to talk to you, if you're willing." Jasmine ran her fingers over the photographs, lingering on images of their mother's face. "I have so many questions." "I have more answers now," Sullivan replied, gesturing to the folder from Florida. "And time, if you'd like to hear them." A long moment passed as Jasmine studied his face, perhaps searching for traces of the brother in the photographs. Finally, she pulled out a chair and sat down again. "Start from the beginning," she said quietly. "Tell me everything." Sullivan sat across from her, opening the folder their mother had sent. Outside, the sun began its descent over Chicago, casting a warm glow through the windows as brother and sister began the delicate process of rebuilding their fractured history, one memory at a time. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the small corner booth at Marie's Diner, where Sullivan and Jasmine had agreed to meet the following weekend. Early morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on the worn leather seats. It was their mother's favorite breakfast spot years ago, though the decor had changed since then. Jasmine arrived first, dressed in casual clothes rather than her scrubs, her hair tied back neatly. She ordered coffee and waited, fingers drumming nervously on the laminated menu. When Sullivan walked in, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of his usual suit, she almost didn't recognize him. "This feels strange," Jasmine admitted as he slid into the booth across from her. "Meeting my brother for breakfast, when last week you were Judge Sullivan imposing a fine on me." Sullivan smiled softly, adding cream to his coffee. "I filed for recusal from any future cases involving you." "And about that fine?" He pulled out an envelope. "I've arranged for it to be reviewed by another judge, given the circumstances." "You don't have to do that," Jasmine said quickly. "I don't want special treatment." "It's not special treatment. It's proper judicial procedure when a conflict of interest is discovered." He paused as their waitress brought plates of French toast, their mother's favorite. "Tell me about your work at the hospital." Jasmine's face lit up as she described her role in pediatrics. "There's this little girl, Emma, fighting leukemia. She never complains about the treatments, just asks me to read her favorite story about a princess who becomes a doctor." She smiled, cutting into her French toast. "I want to open a clinic someday, focusing on underserved communities. Mom wanted to be a nurse," Sullivan shared, before law school convinced her otherwise. "She's going to be proud of you." "Have you told her about finding me?" Sullivan nodded. "She's been calling daily, wanting to know if you'd be open to speaking with her. No pressure, though. She understands if you need time." Jasmine pulled out her phone, showing him photos of her graduation from nursing school. "I always wondered if anyone was watching from the audience, if my birth family." She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "I'd like to talk to her." They spent the next hour sharing stories, filling in the gaps of their separate lives. Sullivan learned about Jasmine's foster parents, some kind, others less so, and her determination to pursue education despite the challenges. He shared memories of their early years together, the lullabies their mother sang, the way baby Sarah would grip his finger with her tiny hand. "I have something for you," Sullivan said, reaching into his messenger bag. He pulled out a small wrapped package. Inside was a silver frame holding the photograph of teenage Michael holding baby Sarah, both laughing at the camera. Jasmine traced the edge of the frame, tears gathering in her eyes. "We look happy." "We were," Sullivan replied softly. "And maybe we can be again, in a different way. I know I can't make up for all the lost years, but I'd like to try being a brother again, if you'll let me." Looking up from the photograph, Jasmine smiled, a genuine smile that reminded Sullivan so much of their mother. "I'd like that. But you have to promise me one thing." "Anything." "No more judge voice when we're having family time. It's a little intimidating." Sullivan laughed, really laughed, for what felt like the first time in years. "Deal. Though I can't promise anything about holiday dinners. I hear big brothers are supposed to be a little intimidating." As they finished their breakfast, plans were made for future meetings, phone numbers exchanged, and bridges long thought burned began to be carefully rebuilt, one conversation at a time. 6 months had passed since the day Judge Sullivan discovered his sister in his courtroom. The winter snow blanketed Chicago as he stood at the podium in the courthouse's main hall, addressing a crowd of reporters, legal professionals, and community members. Jasmine sat in the front row, wearing her nurse's uniform, having come directly from her shift. Today marks the launch of the Family Reunification and Support Program, Sullivan began, his voice carrying through the hall. This initiative will provide resources and assistance to families separated by circumstances beyond their control. His eyes met Jasmine's briefly, drawing strength from her encouraging smile. The program had grown from their own story, though few knew the personal connection that inspired it. Together, they had designed a system to help others navigate the complex path of reconnecting with lost family members, offering legal aid, counseling, and support services. Behind him stood a diverse team of professionals, social workers, legal advisors, and family counselors. Among them was their mother, Eleanor Sullivan, who had flown in from Florida to support the launch. Her presence, once a source of complicated emotions, now felt like a completion of their circle. Our justice system must recognize that behind every case number is a human story, Sullivan continued. We're committed to ensuring that these stories have the opportunity for healing and resolution. After the ceremony, the three Sullivans gathered in his chambers. Eleanor hugged Jasmine tightly, still marveling at having her daughter back in her life. The past months had been filled with long phone calls, shared meals, and careful conversations that gradually rebuilt their bonds. "Your father would be proud," Eleanor said softly, touching Sullivan's arm. "He always said justice should serve humanity, not the other way around." Jasmine adjusted her name badge, which now read Jasmine Turner Sullivan. She had chosen to add the family name after their mother's birthday celebration last month. Speaking of serving humanity, the hospital board approved our proposal for the pediatric clinic. Sullivan beamed with pride. The clinic would serve low-income families, with a special focus on children in foster care. He had helped navigate the legal requirements, while Jasmine brought her medical expertise and personal experience to the project. "We should celebrate," Eleanor suggested. "Marie's Diner still makes the best French toast in Chicago." As they walked through the courthouse corridors, Sullivan noticed how different everything felt. The same marble floors and wooden benches remained, but his perspective had shifted. Each case that crossed his bench now carried the weight of potential family stories, reminding him that justice worked best when tempered with understanding. In the diner, sitting in their usual booth, Jasmine shared stories about her patients, while Eleanor showed them old family photos she'd discovered. Sullivan watched them, remembering the day 6 months ago when he'd first recognized his sister in his courtroom. "You know," Jasmine said, stirring her coffee, "that parking ticket was the best thing that could have happened to me." Sullivan chuckled. "I think it's the first time anyone's ever said that in relation to my courtroom." "Life has strange ways of bringing people together," Eleanor added, squeezing both their hands. "Sometimes what looks like an ending is really a beginning." Outside, snow continued to fall softly on the Chicago streets. Through the diner window, they could see the courthouse where their reunion had begun, its stone facade a reminder of both justice and mercy. Inside, warmth and laughter filled their corner booth as three hearts, once separated by circumstance, continued their journey of healing together. The story that began with a judge's gavel had transformed into something far more precious, a family rebuilt, stronger for having been broken, and more compassionate for having known loss. As they shared their breakfast and their dreams, they knew that while the past couldn't be changed, the future held endless possibilities for love, understanding, and grace.